I want to introduce you to Thomas Kole, who is a technical artist from the Netherlands. And if you see the remarkable job that he has done with the reconstruction of Mexico Tenochtitlan, you will see that it's not an exaggeration when I say that Thomas is a true maestro when it comes to blending technology and art in the world of real-time interactive development. So Catherine is going to put in there just the website of Tenochtitlan that Thomas developed. So for you to have a look at it, it's just fantastic. So Thomas started his journey, let's say, into this world in 2014 when he graduated high school with a science-oriented diploma. And soon after, he will go to Belgium then to become a technical artist. And looking at his, at his development and his CV, I think that Thomas took a very interesting and exciting journey and turn when he joined Force Field VR, where as part of the team, he was entrusted with a very challenging task, which is of bridging basically the gap between technology and art, where he also played an important role in developing new tools and workflows to push the boundaries, let's say, of what could be achieved in virtual reality. And at NAP in the Netherlands, he was part of a dynamic team working on bringing as well real-time augmented reality to live broadcasting, all powered by the Unreal Engine. And more recently, he has become part of YIPE, which is a studio in Amsterdam that specializes in developing real-time interactive installations and games as well for museums and other immersive spaces. And Thomas will probably tell us a bit more about it. And as you will see today, I think particularly that what sets Thomas apart is this unique blend of artistic and technical skills. So I have to say that he's not only an artist, he's also a programmer, but he has both things, right? So I think this is where he truly shines in bridging precisely this gap between two disciplines, which at the end of the day, digital humanities is all about. So welcome, Thomas, and without any more delay, I hand the mic to you. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you for your introduction. I have a presentation. I hope that you can see it. I'll be talking about, my reconstruction of Tenochtitlan that I've called A Portrait of Tenochtitlan. I'm the author, and I'm going to walk you through some of the things that were required to bring this project to life. I'll start with a little bit of an introduction, and at the end there will be plenty of time for questions, but the two main focuses of this talk will be the research and the development. And in practice during the development of this project, these have been very closely linked together. There will be a little bit of research, a little bit of development, a little bit of research, a little bit of development. But I will be talking about these as if they are two different subjects, because otherwise my presentation will be, more rambling than it already will be. I'll start with a little bit of an introduction about me. You've already heard it. I have a background in video game software, whereas most of the 3D side of things has been mostly self-taught. And I'm a big fan of open source software. So throughout the development of the project, I've only used open source software. And I don't have an academic background. So if you see me making mistakes that seem kind of amateuristic from an academic point of view, I am an amateur in that sense. So please do let me know. A little bit about Tenochtitlan. I think it's a city that doesn't need too much introduction, but I'll just touch upon some of the basics. It's the capital of the Aztec Empire, and almost every word in that sentence needs an asterisk because it's been, hotly debated, and the terminology is still evolving. But it was the capital of the inhabitants of the Valley of Mexico that we call the Aztecs, and also known as the Mexica. The city was founded in 1325 approximately, and in its form kind of ended in 1521. I think the city is most famous for its destruction by the conquistadors at the time, but yeah, between this relatively short time period, a little bit over 200 years, the city really exploded. It really grew into this enormous metropolis of almost 200,000 people. The numbers are of course a bit vague, which is easily up to par or bigger than the biggest European cities at the time. Most capitals of most countries were tiny, of only tens of thousands of people, and here you have this enormous metropolis of 200,000 people. And today we call it Mexico City. The city was taken over later by the Spanish and almost entirely destroyed, and its foundation kind of became the new city that we call Mexico City. A little bit about a portrait of Tenochtitlan. I made it in approximately 1.5 years of free time. And I've called it a virtual photography exhibition, which is a bit of a pretentious term, but you kind of go to the website and there's these different images. They're definitely not scientific diagrams. They're definitely kind of these artistic photographs, and so that's kind of the term that I've come to use. I'll take you through some of the images that I've made. This is the religious ceremonial center, kind of juxtaposed next to the dramatic volcano Popocatépetl, which is still active today. Here's an overview from the south of the city. It really shows you kind of the enormous area that it kind of encompasses, and also kind of its sprawl. Most of the buildings, unlike European cities, were single story. This was kind of a necessity because of the poor building ground, which is this swampy, very shallow lake, salty, brackish water. Really big, really spectacular as it lies there in the middle of the lake. Here's Tlatelolco, which is the kind of the twin sister city that the city grew attached to. And here's an overview of the two religious centers against the two volcanic peaks. I want to talk a little bit about the research, which kind of started as soon as the project started. The city has an almost mythical type of aura to it. And I think the city has this aura because of two reasons. One of them is that it's been almost entirely destroyed. None of the original buildings, none of the architecture, none of the kind of the natural features that were around at the time are left. It's been razed, and at the same time we have from the accounts from the conquistadors and also from the original inhabitants, we have all of these accounts that really describe a really beautiful city, something that the Spaniards could only kind of describe as dreamlike and beautiful. And so it kind of lives somewhere where, I don't know, Atlantis or these fictitious cities also live in our minds. But it was a real place, and I've been super interested to see what this city looked like at the time. Also because the renditions that I could find out there were for me insufficient. They didn't kind of satisfy my curiosity or my kind of my appetite for what a city like this could look like. It also really clashed with my view at the time of what any sort of pre-Columbian city could look like, right? I would, in my kind of European mind, I only have, small bands of people in kind of huts in the jungle, and here you have this enormous metropolis, and I just wanted to know what that looked like. What I had hoped to find was something like this. This is a map from Amsterdam, which is from the, I think 1540s or 1560s or something. And if you zoom in a little bit, you see that it's really quite detailed. We have every street, we have every house effectively in there. We have every canal, and maybe if we take this map and we place it on a modern map, it's not perfect, but it would be kind of an easy exercise to pull it back into proportion and to place every building in its place and then call it a day. That is not what I could find for Tenochtitlan. The problem with Tenochtitlan is that almost all of the pre-Columbian archives, the maps that they would have drawn of their city have been destroyed in the conquest, and everything that's come later is of course not quite a good view on the city as it would have been. But we can rely on some historical sources. Of course, there is the archaeological part, which you know, even though all of the buildings have been destroyed, many of the foundations are still there and kind of periodically come up to the ground and are ready for excavation. But it's not easy because the modern day Mexico City, which also has value, is built on top of these ruins. So it's not like some empty field that you can dig up. It's really complicated. It's urban archaeology. But they do give us, I think, the most concrete pieces of information. We have the historical accounts of the conquistadors who, during and after the conquest, were writing letters and describing things in books, and they are obviously they are kind of problematic and they have their own kind of propaganda to push, but they can be really quite valuable if you know what kind of lens to look through them. And there are the what we call the kind of the Aztec codices, which are these most of them are post-colonial documents written by Mexica writers and Mexica historians and artists, but they are kind of dictated and annotated by European colonists. So they also need to be seen through a certain lens, but they do provide a really, in many cases, kind of an authentic view of the city. And I think there's a kind of a fourth category, which is sometimes overlooked, but that is that Mexico City, like every city almost in the world, is buried under only a kind of a very thin layer of modernity. This is a photograph from Xochimilco, which is to the south of Tenochtitlan and is currently part of Mexico City. And what you see here is a person clearly kind of in European clothes, but he lives like an Aztec almost, right? Just like people 100 years ago. This picture is from 1920 something. Just like people 100 years ago from like rural Netherlands would have lived almost like medieval people, almost, right? I mean, there have been developments, but much of the kind of the daily ritual is the same. And this picture, I think, really does that justice. You see that they have the same materials, they have the same landscape, they have the same heritage in a sense, and so they're kind of living a very similar life. Maybe he does have a European pig by now where he can feed his scraps, but yeah, there's still kind of stories about this floating around in the city and amongst the people that might not all have been documented yet. And I think there's much to learn in kind of this fourth category. Archaeology and history of Tenochtitlan is a very well-established field. Of course, it's been studied since forever, and I'm a newcomer in this, and luckily I've had people help me in this regard. I have a list of people here. Some of them are artists who are kind of facing similar struggles that I do, and some of them are scholars who were really helpful in providing feedback and pointing out specific sources that I could look to. There's a couple of books I read to kind of get a better understanding. One of them, The Death of Aztec Tenochtitlan, The Life of Mexico City, which is by Barbara Mundy, which is a really good book about understanding the transitional period from Tenochtitlan into Mexico City, kind of that early colonial era. The Aztecs by Michael E. Smith, which gives a kind of a good basis of the culture and the history as a whole. And The Conquest of New Spain by Bernal Diaz, which is very much a Spanish retelling of the conquest, but it's you know, it's one of the very few very rich descriptions of what the city was like, how it like breathed and lived and such. That gives us a big picture view. This is an aerial view of the city from 1858, which is taken from a balloon and then sketched out. What we see here is you know, 200 years after the conquest, but Mexico City still looks a lot like Tenochtitlan. The lake is being drained, but it's still very marshy, very swampy, and so the people still need to make use of these causeways to get from A to B, to get kind of outside of the city. And you won't find, you know, Aztec pyramids or that sort of sense. But this does give us kind of a good idea of kind of the man-made and natural landscape. And it's kind of good news that this is 200 years after, because we can extrapolate backwards into time and take the more contemporary maps and see, you know, what changes were made when in history, and kind of create kind of this area of artistic license where you can kind of make these best guesses. Here's a map which is super influential in the mapping of Tenochtitlan. This is the map at Uppsala. I've put it upside down. I'll show you why later. But what you see here here are kind of these astronomical axes of the city, which are kind of the northeast, south, and west, where the city was divided against. And there's no ceremonial precinct anymore. Instead, we have the kind of the most important cathedrals and stuff. And this is 40 or so years after the conquest. But the city is still surrounded by the lake. It's very much still operated by people with Mexican knowledge and who are kind of utilizing the terrain as the Mexica would have. This is, I think, the very most important source when it comes to laying out the city. And the nice thing about this map is that when you take it and you overlay it against a modern map, a modern satellite image or a modern map of Mexico City, it lines up remarkably well. It's not quite triangulated in the way that we would map now. You do need to kind of pull it into proportion, but it's pretty good. And luckily, I'm not the first to do this. I've had tremendous help from Thomas Vilsinger, who has been mapping Tenochtitlan for decades. He's been creating this really nice and coherent view of the city, and he has really shown me like the various sources and his interpretation of the city. And I think that with the information that is available, we can make a really good estimate of what the city would have been like. Sure, there are even more things that we probably will never know, but I think we can get quite close. That is a bigger picture, but I'm also interested in the smaller picture, because the from kind of the get-go, I wanted to have an aerial perspective, kind of a bird's eye or drone's view, and for that we do need to go smaller. What you see here on the right is a picture from Xochimilco, which has these kind of characteristic trees and plots of farmland, which has been preserved really quite well. And even though it is not Tenochtitlan, it's a different city, it does show kind of the core fabric of the city. And we see this reflected here in the partial plan of Mexico City, which is a very early colonial map of, for as far as I know, a still unknown part of the city. Maybe it wasn't even Tenochtitlan, I'm not sure. But what you see here is the kind of the super well organized and rigorous grid-like layout of the city. You see these long strips of farmland, which is surrounded by water. Each of them is home to a household, and each of them has a canal running horizontally and alternating footpaths. And it really shows how organized the city was. And I'm sure that in practice, some of the parts of the city were more organized and some of them were less organized, but it does give an idea of the kind of the size and scope of the city. Here's some content from some of the codices which show the different types of houses that were built. None of the houses are still standing, but we know that people built single-story houses, sometimes with thatched roofs, sometimes with flat roofs, sometimes out of stone or adobe, sometimes just out of wood. These would have been commoner houses, which I think the commoner houses are you do have some artistic license. I mean, you can get away if you just make like a thatched hut. You know, it's going to look quite all right because it occupies a few pixels, but there's also monumental architecture, which is a lot more complicated. On the left, you see the palace of Moctezuma Xocoyotzin, which is the last emperor of the Mexica. We have written descriptions of this palace, and we have the palace in this drawing on the left. But we also know that the palace has been destroyed, and on the foundation has been built the Palacio Nacional in Mexico City, next to the Zocalo. It's an enormous building, and it really doesn't rhyme with kind of this almost crude drawing on the left. So you can imagine what kind of artistic license is required to extrapolate the crude drawing into the enormous palace. Here's some people that have done it before me. Scott and Stuart Gentling in their beautiful paintings have really made this super beautiful palace. And Paul Guinan, who's working on this Aztec Empire visual novel, has made his interpretation. On the bottom you see mine. I've tried to incorporate some of the multi-level stuff. We know that it was probably raised to prevent flooding damage. We know that that kind of as an exclusive right, the emperor had a kind of a bigger house and multi-story houses. But I can absolutely confidently say that this rendition is wrong. There's no way it would have looked like this, but it's somewhere within that cloud of all the possibilities, and I've tried to do my best to bring it about. But yeah, it's kind of a recurring theme throughout this whole project, that you have to really work with very little to create a lot. I can't put like a black square and say, we don't know about the palace. I can't get away with that. I need to put something there. This is what I put there. I'll talk about the development, which is going to be a bit more technical. If you're familiar with Blender and kind of software development as a whole, some of this should be familiar. If it's not familiar, don't worry about it. I'll not go too deep into it. The project was made with Blender, which is this open source 3D modeling software. I've been using it for many years, and it's my go-to favorite. When I started the project, they've added this new feature where you can kind of tackle your projects a bit more in the way that a software developer would. So you kind of create these rules, these structures with which you build your city. I'll get more in detail about that later on in the presentation. It's a really important core aspect of the whole project. One of the first things that I did, and I think is absolutely crucial as a first step in any such project, is you need to do a feasibility test. You need to see how much have you bitten off and how much can you chew, if you will. When I started implementing the terrain, which was the first thing that I did, just plug down the terrain, put an atmosphere in, put the water down, and just kind of get a feel of how big the city is. I immediately scoped down my project. The first idea was that I was going to do kind of these kind of satellite views from all the way up, seeing the whole lake, down to street level, where you can see people with baskets and whatnot. Immediately went out the window. I immediately scoped down the project into kind of this aerial perspective, and even with that enormous downscoping, I still had a lot on my hands. So doing a feasibility like this is super crucial, that you don't get stuck later on in the project. I worked my project outside in, so I started with the terrain and worked my way into the city. This is crucial because once you have your terrain down, you can you can kind of lock it in place, and that means that anything you do afterwards will not affect the terrain anymore. That downstepping, where first you do the terrain, then you do the layout of the cities and the causeways, that sort of stuff is super crucial, because otherwise you will spend most of your time rearranging stuff that you've already made. You want to avoid that as much as possible, because it's just an enormous time sink. I've done the same for the city itself, right? Starting with the outskirts, working my way back into the city. Here's the terrain itself. Obviously super crucial to begin with. You need to determine for yourself how much do you want to represent, how far can the camera look. All of this is done inside of Blender with geometry nodes to just to bring it in. And what I immediately noticed, my first kind of intuition was to go about this in kind of a naive way, and just to populate the whole city, or the whole scene with trees, which very quickly became obvious that wasn't possible. I needed to think of some way to make it handleable by yourself and by the computer. And this is where my background in games kind of comes into play, because I've had to kind of think in a more video gamey way and less of a kind of programmer way. And I came up with a system where instead of placing individual trees, which would have been, you know, in the billions, I came up with kind of this trickery which placed images of trees on kind of as a quilted cloth over the entire area, but each of the quilted like squares would be aiming towards the camera, and that gives an impression of a lot of trees and definitely works well from an aerial perspective. But you know, you can't walk amongst the trees. You can't bring the camera down into the kind of into the forest. But I was not interested in that anyway. It was for a backdrop. It just needed to look right. And by augmenting that with some like curvature maps and kind of simulating where rivers would flow and where wetness would accumulate, I could kind of give colors to the trees and make them more or less scarce. And I think it worked out fine. Instead of having billions of trees, I had 0. But there is an edge case because it is like a quilted cloth. You don't see the contours. There's no like nice speckly dots on the tree lines. So you know, you take that, you turn it into an edge case. You say, okay, I'm just gonna get the contours. I'm gonna place trees there and nowhere else, and works perfectly fine. Here's some more kind of the node-based programmer-like environment that I was talking about earlier. On the left, you see that I'm kind of a messy worker. I just do whatever needs to happen to make it work. And on the right, you can see the result. I knew that from the get-go that all of these chinampas, which would be thousands across the city, I couldn't like model them individually and then place trees and then figure out that, oh, actually there needs to be a road right down here, so I need to throw away all my work. What I have instead is a system that does it automatically. I give it a square or any sort of shape that I want, and it's going to populate it with trees, with farmland. It's going to give houses. It's going to flesh it out completely, and that means that if I want to change the layout later, I have 0 work when it comes to when it comes to kind of populating the rest of the scene. That's super crucial in a project like this, of this scope. During the development of the process, I sometimes struggled with motivation because it's been a very long project, almost 2 years, a bit more than 1.5, and it was done so in kind of in free time and weekends, whenever I had some hours to spare. And it would not be uncommon for me to be stuck on a small problem for a week or so. And then you look back and you think, oh my God, I haven't done anything this week. This is going nowhere. But by keeping kind of these regular screenshots, which is what I've done, like at the end of every session, I would like get one nice view, take a screenshot, save it to my hard drive. And I could come back to them and see them in chronological order, which would kind of help me stay motivated and see, you know, how far I would have come from, you know, a week or 2 or a month ago. And as a side effect, what happens here is that you can very easily spot visual regression, which is kind of a programmer's term. But what sometimes happens is that you create something, and even though you're working on it, you think, oh, this looks kind of nice. This is a nice viewpoint, or the light is playing really well off of the trees or whatever. And you have that image in your mind, but you continue working and you come back, and then you take that same vantage point, the same light, and it doesn't sparkle anymore. It doesn't shine in the way that you want. By keeping these screenshots, you can look back and say, hey, what's changed? Why don't the trees catch the light in the way that I liked anymore? And why does the water not glisten like in the sun that I had before? And why does this point of view not work anymore? If you don't keep those screenshots or those images, you will kind of have forgotten about it. But this kind of keeps the quality up, and I think it's really important. And it's also fun to look back. You know, once you're done, you have all of this to kind of look back at. Here's another system that scales. I knew that I wasn't going to get too close to most of the architecture, but it did need to look correct from a distance. And so what I have here is a very crude model of a temple. This one didn't make it into the final thing, but it's kind of a decent example for something that could work in the background. On the left, it looks like a plastic model maybe, and on the right, there's some weathering to it. I designed a system that would take the model on the left and kind of automatically apply this weathering. And if during the development I decided that it needed to be twice as long or wide or tall or be configured completely different, it's no problem. I didn't have to reapply the weathering. It would just work. These sort of systems that kind of don't break your workflow, if you know that you're going to have to alter things in the future, you could call it like non-destructive, are super important in projects like these. They can be overrated. There's like a point at which you're doing it too much and everything becomes automated. That's not what you're looking for. But you definitely want to kind of take the most tedious tasks out of your hands. Here's another example of this. I knew that I was going to have quite a lot of palaces and these more noble types of architecture. But I did not have the time to really flesh them all out. I mean, each of these palaces could have easily been a whole project on its own, but there's no time. So I developed a little system that would take what you have on the left here, which is this collection of blocks, which takes minutes to put together, and automatically transforms it into this more credible looking place. And it's not completely automated. I still am completely in charge of where the doors go, where the pillars go, where the ventilation holes go, all that sort of stuff. I'm still completely in control, but the input is very minimal. It's just some blocks, and the output is very detailed. Here you can see it in process. Here's kind of an iteration 0, and here I'm halfway done, and here it is completely done. And so almost everything that you see here, so the kind of the way the rainwater culminates on the roof and leaves these stains, to the way it like trickles down the sides of the stairs, that sort of stuff is all procedural. I don't have to paint that in by hand. It really takes a lot of time out of my hands. What I've said before applies to everything throughout the whole project. As long as there is more than 10 of something, like canoes or houses or reeds or trees or whatever, there's some sort of system that kind of takes that work out of my hands and does it for me. And it might not look too good up close, right? If you look at this courtyard, for example, it's kind of boring. There's just some houses with some emptiness, but in an image like this, you don't notice it. It's fine. It's about the bigger picture. Which is why I think it works quite well and is super important to keep in mind. There is, of course, some handwork, right? It's not like I wrote a script that kind of magically creates a whole religious area or precinct or whatever, but I did, when it like the bigger suburbs, if you want, there's almost no handwork in them. They're just placed automatically. The final stage, I think, was most fun of the project, where I had my 3D model and I would just kind of fly around my virtual drone and be in control of the weather and the clouds and kind of position it however I wanted to get a perfect shot. And after I had, rendered my images, I would export them and bring them into GIMP and Darktable to really make them pop. There's always a kind of a final kind of a post-processing or a touch-up phase, like you have with any photography. I mean, if I spend 2 hours rendering an image and there's a house in the lake, I'm not going to go back and fix it. I'm just going to, paint it out. Yeah, this is where that sort of software comes into play. Here's a couple of editor screenshots. This is the religious center of the city with the market and the palaces. And here's kind of a more tele shot of the volcanoes and the city. I want to talk a little bit about the launch itself, because I think it's kind of unexpectedly become part of the project. It's been It's been really successful. It's been seen by presumably, I don't have numbers, but presumably tens of millions of people in Mexico and outside, which has kind of that's beyond what I had remotely expected for this project. And that all started when I decided when to stop, because at some point you have to say, okay, I can spend 2 more months like detailing out this part of the city or this part of the lake or this whatever. But at some point you have to say, enough is enough. I need to get this out of there. I need to get it out of my mind and into the world. And yeah, at some point you just kind of naturally feel it. That's a nice part about a hobby project. You can kind of decide yourself when to stop. And yeah, at some point I pulled the switch and said, this is it. I'm going to do all the renders and let's see what happens. Very early on, I thought it would be really cool to get comparisons between Mexico City as it is today and Tenochtitlan as it was back then. And I thought it would be really cool to do that via drone images. I don't have a drone. I'm not in Mexico City, so that was already kind of a big problem. But luckily, I found Andreas Simo, who is a drone operator in Mexico City and knows a lot about the history and really knows the city by heart. And he just said, let's do it. This sounds super cool. And we went into Google Earth Studio, which is kind of this secondary tool to Google Earth, where we could not only pick the exact location, but also hide and field of view and angle of where we wanted the drone images. And I would take that information and put it in Blender and then render the same image. And we could see, oh, well, this isn't a very nice composition. We have to kind of move more this way, that way, before he had to go into the air. That was really helpful because the amount of days in Mexico City where it is a good time for a drone image are very low, very bad air quality, a lot of pollution. Most of the time you can see only, maybe a couple of blocks is over exaggerating, but you cannot see very far. So we really needed to make sure we had the shots down before we went into the air. And that just worked out. It worked really well. When you are in the sky, you can't see Tenochtitlan, so we had to do it beforehand, and this was a perfect tool to do it. I knew I wanted translations, obviously in Spanish because it's gonna kind of appeal to the Spanish audience, but also in Nahuatl, which is the native language of the Mexica as it was spoken back then. But unlike Latin, which is a dead language, Nahuatl is still spoken by quite a few million people. So it just made sense to include it. And I found a translator, and we worked together with the text that I initially wrote, and he translated them. It just worked out. I mean, there were a couple of legal terms which were hard to translate, but for the rest, yeah, it's a language like any other, and you can just convey information. And we put it on there. And I think it's a little bit hard to say, but about 10% of the people that go to the website click on Nahuatl. I don't think 10% of the people that visit actually speak it, but it does show that people are curious and interested in the language. And I'm glad that I ended up including it. I built a simple CMS to kind of handle that, which basically means that I had my original text on the left, and the translator could just go to the website, enter the text, and dynamically see how the translations would work in context. Some of the translations, for example, were descriptions of images, which you need the image in order to know what the description is going to be. So a simple system like this was a good choice. And that leads us kind of to the end result. There's the website, the Port of Tenochtitlan, a beautiful rendition of the glyph by an artist called Mikawason Mexica. He was kind enough to make that for me. And I think, the rest is history. I put it out there, and people have seen it, and it's still going on. I'll end with some images. This is the city kind of being surprised by heavy showers. Here's the Sacred Precinct as it is, as it would have looked like in the early morning of the equinox, where the sun rises directly between the two temples on top of the major pyramid. Here's a view from that same pyramid, which shows you kind of how far you can look when you stand on top of the pyramids. You can see all the way into the Chapultepec mountains and the Guadalupe mountains. Here's a bit of a treat. I started experimenting with some video. I'm not sure what to do with it yet. I'm sure there's some sort of potential, but here we are rotating around the sacred precinct of Tlatelolco. And I think in video you really kind of get a sense of the size of the city and the sprawl and the scale. So that concludes my talk. I've touched upon, I think, the topics that I wanted to talk about, and I'm super curious to hear, yeah, what you think, and if you have any comments or questions, I'm happy to hear.
Thank you, Thomas. That was not only really interesting, but really, really cool. So just to remind you, if you want to ask your questions, you can basically raise your digital hand, or you can post them basically through the chat. If you prefer, that's perfectly fine. I think, yeah, I mean, many times that I have seen your work, Thomas, and your website, I tend to be, you know, kind of like out of breath, precisely because I grew up in Mexico City. I can feel, you know, like your rendering, for instance, of the rain pouring down, which happens still in Mexico City as such, right? That you see actually the curtain of water coming down, and also, you know, the kind of like rendering of the mist coming down as well. You can still experience this in some parts like Xochimilco, Milpalta, and so on. And so it is such an incredible way of bringing to life very much, you know, this incredible city. So yeah, I think as Bertrand just said, your work is overwhelming. I think it is, in a very positive way. You know, I think it has been such a treat for us to actually see, you know, the city as such. At the scale that I think we could just either imagine, or sometimes we do have had, you know, renditions from architects and so on of certain parts of the city. And so it has been very much in the imagination of archaeology and history for many, many years. But I think it is the very first time that we can see it in such a scale, and, you know, with such a force, in a way. Emotionally, I think I will say touching for the people that work either on Tenochtitlan or in Mexico in general. So right, so is there any question from the public? Right, so Christine?
Hi, Thomas. Thank you for your presentation. I'm Christine from the University of Maine. My question to you, and thank you for telling me about the process, not just the research as well. I'm curious that oftentimes with historic mapping or reconstruction projects, photorealism is actually oftentimes secondary because it's more getting a sense of orientation and thinking about relationships of where things are to another. And I was curious whether working on the project sort of prompted you to ask any spatial questions, gave you a sense of experience of spaces in a different way, or whether you've heard from collaborators or academics in the field who are interested in sort of like almost exploring your model to ask their own questions.
Yeah, that's a good question. I think because it kind of strictly isn't a kind of an academic resource, right? I can't grant that it's accurate, but I think these sort of models do give a certain they provide a certain intuition about things that you can only get when you visit, right? For example, maybe before this project I thought, oh, can people on the outskirts, can they see the top of Templo Mayor? Like, what would that have done to them, for example? And now you can actually answer that. I can like put my camera there and look towards it, and, you know, from the furthest outskirts, you kind of can't because there's trees in the way. And from the major roads, if you approach, you definitely can. You see it like towering over everything. So I think, yes, it did. One of the interesting. I haven't explored this like to full extent yet, and I'm definitely looking to kind of kind of work this out a little bit further. But for example, there's one of the famous passages in the kind of the descriptions of the conquistadors where they walk in between Popocatépetl and Iztaccíhuatl. They walk down the two volcanoes and they look into the lake and they say, wow, we can see the lake, we can see the city. If I put my camera there, I can't see the city. It's too far away. So either they are making it up or they are confusing two different places. But you would need a telescope to see it from there because you're really far away from the city and the city is quite small. So I think it would be interesting to work that out further. And I'm of course open for people to ask me this, and I'm definitely willing to collaborate. I'm also thinking of somehow, I can't just throw this model out there because it takes like a supercomputer to run it, and I can't expect it of everyone, but I want to see if I can create some sort of like Google Earth-like tool where you can kind of position yourself in different places. But I'm not sure. I'm still seeing what the possibilities there are. Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Christine. Catherine?
Hi, thank you so much. That was really, really interesting, and especially to see the whole process behind. And also your solution with the trees was fantastic. It's really cool to see. You also called it at the beginning a virtual photography exhibition. Yeah. I wonder, is that kind of how you initially imagined it in your mind as the end product, and did this kind of change as the project went on?
Both. I did. I've done like video games for most of both my professional career and kind of as side projects, and I wanted to see more the other side where it's more it's not real time, but it's you really focus on getting quality and getting the rain to look good, that sort of thing. So I did think that I was going to kind of get these. Initially, I was thinking only one image, like just as simple as like weekend project, whatever. Quickly grew out of hand, but I was always thinking about having these different perspectives as a normal photographer would, right? There's all these beautiful photos of other cities that really kind of make you feel what the city is like, and I definitely wanted to recreate that. Yeah.
Bertrand?
You were muted, Patricia.
Yeah, no, sorry, I was just telling Bertrand that we cannot hear you. Yeah, no problem. Yeah. Okay, is there any other question while Bertrand is just sorting out his his audio? It's all right, Bertrand, take your time. I just had a little question for you, Thomas, in this sense. So, so in your process of working with academics, for instance, I know that you consulted several of us and so on. What was the part that you find most difficult of it?
I think the most difficult part was it was not working with the academics. They were very nice and very very helpful in kind of understanding my lack of understanding in general. That was very nice. What is really difficult is to kind of take the artistic license. That is the most difficult part, right? Because there's 90% is just like unknown unknowns, but you need to make something. You want to kind of validate that artistic license against kind of the academia, like, hey, I've put this here, is that correct? And nobody would know. And then you're like, okay, well, I also don't know, so who knows, right? That's really difficult. Yeah, that was really difficult to get that right.
That's really interesting, Thomas, and it's good to know as an academic as well, obviously, how to work with artists. Bertrand, I think you fixed the thing. Oh no, I cannot hear you still. Can you hear him, Thomas? No?
No, sorry. Maybe
write it in the chat, Bertrand. We will, yeah, I will ask Thomas directly. In the meantime, is there any other question? Sally?
Yeah, I mean, one thing I really liked about your talk, Thomas, was your the way you talked about like sort of almost the psychological aspect, or you know how you found it hard to keep motivated. This is interesting to me because I have a Minecraft project that, like, the very first iteration, which was horrendous because I hadn't learned that there were any tools to help me, was just a labor of love. I just did it over the Christmas holiday and I was just playing around. And then, now I do it for work. So I guess my roundabout question is, I find this really interesting, like to what extent do you think the fact that it wasn't a work project, that it had another motivation, how did that bear upon it? Does that make sense?
Yeah,
Like,
I see what you mean. I mean, on one hand, kind of a lack of time was really difficult, and I think definitely at some points, I'm not shy to admit, I was pouring in more hours than maybe I should have. Kind of going from just kind of raw motivation. But yeah, it also, it has a positive side in that you can. I took breaks over the kind of the summer because if the weather was nice enough to be outside, I wasn't behind my computer. But at the same time, the fact that you have to do it with the little free time that you have is really difficult. I think if I want to do something like this again, I would definitely want to do it at least with someone else, so that you can kind of discuss it and kind of have like a second pair of eyes to look at it. I would definitely need to take more time out of my schedule to do something like this, and not only cram it into the weekends and the after hours. But yeah, with motivation, if it's your own motivation and there's nobody paying me to do it, there's nobody putting up deadlines, that is nice. Yeah, that's true.
Yeah, thank you, Thomas. And Bertrand has asked, why did you choose the Creative Commons license to share your work?
Yes, good question. Sorry about the microphone. I thought it was the right thing to do, because I think it's kind of this broader philosophical thing, I guess, but I think in terms of education, people should use it anyway. And they can use it anyway, even if it was commercially licensed. But I think it's more important that it reaches more people and kind of has this educational goal and can achieve that, rather than it being commercial. I could probably ask like some license fees if I wanted to, but I didn't. As a result, I didn't make any money off the project. That's the second one. It only cost me money, but that's all right because it's a hobby. And I think it was kind of the very first thing that I've always said to everyone that I've worked together with was like, hey, this is not a commercial project. It's going to be freely licensed. If you can collaborate, I don't have a budget. I don't expect you to work for free, but know that it is, free like this. So it just aligns with what I think is the right thing to do, and I ended up choosing that license. Yeah, does that answer your question?
I think it probably does. I think it is quite important in terms also of working with places, for instance, from the Global South, precisely thinking of, what people can actually access and what can be shared and what not. I think that's very important. And so we are actually very grateful that you put this in a Creative Commons license so it can be, repurposed, reused and so on. Usually we do citation and so on, but I think it was very, very important for, the community in general to actually know that you could do that. Okay, right. So we are getting to the end of our time now. And so we will stop the questions now, but we want to thank you again, Thomas. I'm pretty sure everyone will join me as well to say, thank you, and to actually thank you for the really interesting work that you have done. And so if you have any other questions, I think we can probably share them in the chat at the moment, and we will make sure that Thomas receives them just in case, and we will make sure that we pass them to you whenever we have the time. So thank you again, Thomas, and we will see you in the next Hangout. We will announce it in our, in our usual channels. And for those of you that couldn't be here, or if you want to share, this video is going to be available from our YouTube channel. As always, look for the Digital Humanities Hangouts in Lancaster in YouTube. So thank you very much again, Thomas. Thanks to everyone. And so see you next time. Thanks.
Thank you so much.